What's up, guys? Back with another educational video. This week, we're talking about carbohydrate cellularity. What? Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment for the algorithm! Carbohydrate cellularity. Yeah, that was a new one to me too. Never had heard that term, actually. This paper was looking at differences in carbohydrate cellularity and its effects on primarily visceral adipose tissue, so basically like how much fat you have in your liver, as well as a few other markers. And it was a pretty long-term study, actually. But let's not bury the lead. What the is carbohydrate cellularity? Carbohydrate cellularity basically refers to carbohydrates with more fiber. So whole, intact carbohydrate, non-refined sources of carbohydrate. It's not exactly what it means, but for all intensive purposes, that's what it means. The carbohydrates in whole, intact carbohydrate sources typically are like wrapped up in the fibrous cellular material of the plant. When they refer to cellularity, that's what they're talking about. So higher fiber, non-refined, intact sources of carbohydrate. Acellular carbohydrates are defined as refined carbohydrates. So difference between like whole wheat bread and white bread, stone ground oats and quick oats, whole wheat pasta and white pasta, brown rice and white rice, you get the drift. This was a pretty cool study because they did it in obese people and it was over 12 months. So long study, 192 participants, and they put them on 3 different diets that were equal in calories, or at least they were designed to be equal in calories, but I'll get to that in a second. Acellular carbohydrate diet, which was carbohydrates primarily from refined sources. A cellular carbohydrate diet, which was, again, whole intact sources of carbohydrate, non-refined with high amounts of fiber. And then a low-carb, very high-fat diet. Now, in all the diets, protein was equal. It was 17% of daily calories. Now, that's really important because, as we know, protein has a satiety effect and it also has an effect on thermogenesis. So it's important that they equated protein. Great job. Now, in the acellular and cellular carbohydrate diets, they went with a carbohydrate intake of 45% and a fat intake of 38%, which actually by some metrics, some people might even still consider a low carb diet, since some people's inclusion criteria of low carb diets can be 45% and under, but they did not call it that, which I think is good. The low carb diet was definitely low carb. 8% carbohydrate, 17% protein, and 75% fat. Very, very low carbohydrate, and almost all the carbohydrates were exclusively from fibrous sources of carbohydrate. So what did they find? Even though they were trying to equate calories, they did find that the acellular carbohydrate group consumed a little bit more calories than the cellular carbohydrate group or the low carb group. Now, that's not really surprising when you consider that low carb diets have been shown to have some anorectic effects, and diets high in fiber have been shown to have anorectic effects. So it looks like there was some improved satiety there. So even though they were meant to be equal in calories, they didn't quite end up being equal in calories, and that explains a lot of the results. So what were the results? Well, the primary outcome was they were looking at visceral adipose tissue, which is a really big indicator for metabolic health. If you have low amounts of visceral adipose tissue, or VAT as they call it, you typically have better health outcomes. Whereas if you have high amounts of VAT, you have much worse metabolic health. And that even holds true for people with low or high subcutaneous adipose tissue. So even if somebody isn't obese, if they have high amounts of visceral adipose tissue, it's not very good for metabolic health, and vice versa. If you have high amounts of subcutaneous adipose tissue, but low visceral adipose tissue, you actually might not be so bad off in terms of your metabolic health. And we do see this with people who are obese, but have low amounts of visceral adipose tissue and tend to have like pretty normal blood markers of metabolic health. So again, a pretty important marker. Now, what did they find? Well, they didn't find any differences between the diets at 12 months in terms of reductions in visceral adipose tissue. All 3 groups had reductions in visceral adipose tissue, and they also didn't find any differences in subcutaneous adipose tissue. Now, they did see a little bit of difference between the low carb, high fat diet and the acellular carbohydrate diet in subcutaneous adipose tissue volume, which is a secondary measurement, at 6 months, but then there was no difference at 12 months. There was no difference in body weight, body fat, BMI. In fact, that's the real take take home from this study is there weren't really many differences in any marker. Both groups lost similar amounts of weight, lost similar amounts of visceral adipose tissue, and so it's not surprising that we saw similar improvements in most markers of health. Now, they did see differences in adherence at 3 months, with the low-carb diet having better adherence than the acellular carbohydrate diet, but it didn't have a difference from the cellular carbohydrate diet. But they only saw that difference in 3 months, and actually, the low-carb diet, interestingly, had the highest rate of adherence, which was 80% at 3 months, and also the lowest rate of adherence, which was at 12 months. So what's the take home from this study? Well, the take home in my mind really is, if you want to improve your metabolic health and you're overweight or obese, the best thing you can do overall is lose fat. A calorie deficit that helps you reduce your body fat is going to be your best bet. And it doesn't appear to matter so much how that calorie deficit is induced. And this just adds to the body of literature demonstrating that. Now, I will say, I think it's a good idea to eat fibrous sources of carbohydrate. Even if you're on a low-carb diet, it's probably a good idea to include vegetables pretty liberally. They're not going to impact your blood glucose or your insulin for the most part, except maybe if you ate a bunch of carrots or something like that, or potatoes, since they're technically a vegetable. Fiber also has satiety benefits, and it has benefits on longevity, whereas every 10-gram increase in fiber has been shown to reduce the risk of all-cause mortality by 10%. So now that's not saying you can't just eat 100 grams of fiber a day and you're going to be immortal. That's not how relative risk ratio works. But by eating a high fiber diet, it consistently shows reductions in cardiovascular disease and the risk of cancer. If you like a low-carb diet, if you like a high-carb diet, fine. Both can work. If you're eating a high-carb diet, it's okay to eat some refined sources of carbohydrates. Again, this study showed that the group that was getting the acellular diet, which was refined carbohydrates, still had similar improvements in visceral adipose tissue compared to the other groups. It might be a little bit more difficult to adhere to that diet because it's going to be a little bit lower in fiber and maybe not as satiating. So again, regardless of the diet you choose, whether it be low carb or high carb or anything in between, make sure you're eating enough fiber, one, just because it's good for you, and two, because of the satiety benefits. Now guys, whether you like low carb or high carb or anything in between, we designed Carbon Diet Coach to work with any dietary preference, because if we look at the research data, it becomes very, very clear in most of these studies where the appropriate variables are controlled and equated for, you just don't see differences in weight loss, fat loss, lean mass. As long as you control protein and have the appropriate calorie deficit, that is the most important factor. And so you should pick the dietary preference for you that makes it the easiest to adhere to. If you're interested in Carbon Diet Coach, click the link in the description to download, and I'll catch you guys next week.